All right, I'd like to welcome everyone to Hot Off the Press, the show about new releases and the people that bring them to us. This week, we're doing something slightly different with our Q&A. We're happy to have the editors of Zombies Need Brains anthologies, as well as a couple of authors that will be appearing in one of the upcoming releases. So let's go ahead and go around the horn and introduce everyone. Start with Joshua.
Hello, everybody. My name is Joshua Palmatier. I am a fantasy author with DAW Books. I have 9 novels out at the moment, 3 trilogies. Okay, and somewhere along the way, I got into editing, and I edited a couple anthologies for DAW, and the bug stuck. And I ended up starting a small press called Zombies Need Brains, and we're on, I don't even remember anymore. We've got 16 anthologies with the 3 coming out this year all together. And so I've been doing it for 6 years now, something like that. And we fund all of our anthologies with Kickstarter that usually runs starting sometime in August. And we always do an open call for submissions for all of the anthologies. Half of the anthology we fill up with what I call anchor authors, and then the other half is filled up with the open call. And we have an anchor author with us today for My Battery is Low, and we have somebody who got in through the open call for My Battery is Low today. So hopefully we'll get a chance to chat with them about that. And write some short stories that have been in a few anthologies as well. But in general, that's me.
All right, thank you. And let's go to Crystal.
I'm Crystal, and by day, I'm an NPR journalist and producer. By night, I'm a writer, editor. I also wrangle authors as a marketing consultant for them. And I'm fairly certain that is, in fact, harder than herding cats. I write speculative fiction of all kinds. I've got a few publications in smaller magazines and anthologies, and I'm about halfway through a novel about a family of hoodoo witches. So.
All right.
That's good.
Sam.
I'm S.C. Butler, also known as Sam Butler. There are lots of Samuel Butlers that have been published out there. So when I sold my trilogy to Tor Books many years ago, I had to come up with something different, which is why I came up with S.C. Butler, but anybody please call me Sam. I have an odd background. I've been a writer for a long time. I tried to write right out of college, which was almost 45 years ago. Had agents, was different back then, but never actually sold anything, and got married, started having family, and time to get a job. So I ended up going from being the writer in the garret to being a fixed income trader on Wall Street. And did that for a few years. Worked as a banker, worked as a trader, lived through some interesting times, and managed to start writing again after I got laid off from my last trading job. Wrote a fantasy trilogy called The Stoneways, which Tor published, the 3 books from 2006 to 2009, I guess is when they came out. Sold a few short stories since. Parted ways with my agent, had lots of fun stories to tell about what it's like to be published by Tor, and which I think most Tor authors can usually share. And ended up, got to know Josh very well. I don't think we ever knew each other at the Online Writers Workshop, but we were 2 alumni. And Josh came up to me at one of my first cons and one of his first cons to say hello. And we've been very good friends ever since. So when Josh asked me first to write stories for some of the early DAW and early ZNB stories, the anthologies, I jumped on the opportunity. And then when it was obvious that Josh and his first editor-in-chief, Patricia Bray, were about to kill each other because they were doing so many anthologies together, I jumped at the chance to come in and be an editor as well, which I find to be probably as much fun in the writing process as I've ever done in my life. So thank you, Josh, for letting me do it with you.
All right. And John.
Hi, I'm John Hartness, and for the purposes of this call, I'm the author of multiple urban fantasy and fantasy series the Quincy Harker Demon Hunter novels, Bubba the Monster Hunter short stories and novellas, the Black Knight Chronicles urban fantasy, and I'm one of the anchor authors in My Battery is Low and It Is Getting Dark, which I was very excited to be a part of. Joshua and I have talked back and forth for a few years trying to find a project that my work and style would be a good fit for. I was really excited about this this concept, and several of my friends have worked with Zombies Need Brains on anthologies either as writers or editors, so I'd heard really good things about the company. And I was, over the last 18 months, I got back in a groove of writing short stories. I had a period of time from 2010 to probably 2015 where I wrote a lot of short stories, did 10 or 12 anthologies plus another couple dozen shorts that I self-published. But I hadn't done any for several years. And now within the last 18 months, I've had 6 different anthologies coming out with stories in them. And it's been a real fun challenge for me, as Joshua and Crystal will attest, to pare it down again. I used to be the guy who writes tight. I'm not the guy who writes tight anymore, so we can talk about that part of the process.
All right, and finally, Alex.
Hey guys, I'm Alexander Gideon. My writing style can best be summed up by the phrase, and many people died. I think Joshua can attest to that, especially with the story that came out in Temporally Deactivated. I have been writing for a long time, most of my life. I've been writing seriously since I was 19. Sold my first story to Joshua in Zombies Need Brains back in The Razor's Edge. It was my first sale. This is my third. My story, Terra 356, comes out in My Battery's Low and It's Getting Dark, there over my left shoulder. And yeah, Joshua has taught me how to write stories to 7,500 words exactly.
And then he cuts 1,000, right?
Pretty much, about 1,000, yeah.
That's a much smaller percentage of your words than I cut from your first novella.
That's fair. It's about 10,000 out of the first novella.
Yeah, I cut about 25%.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so let's get a little background on Zombies Need Brains. How did it start? Where did the name come from?
Okay, I sort of got into it a little bit in the introduction. Basically, at a convention, it was the Montreal convention, World Fantasy, I think. We were at a book signing before that with a whole bunch of authors. It was a group book signing at a Barnes & Noble. And we went to the bar afterwards, of course. And we, during the course, drinking and commiserating over sales and all that kind of stuff, I just threw out there that we should do an anthology about a bar, a time-traveling bar. And Patricia threw in that, Gilgamesh to be the bartender, and that's how he got his immortality. And everybody laughed and laughed. And I went home and I actually wrote it up. And at the Montreal convention, I went to Techno, a couple people that worked at Techno, and I said, how do you go about becoming an editor for an anthology for DAW? And the road was through Techno. And so they said, well, what's your idea? So I gave them a little pitch, and they pitched it to DAW the next day. And the next thing I know, we're doing an anthology. Patricia and I were editing an anthology for DAW. And we did another one the next year. So the first one was After Hours, and then the second one was Modern Phase Guide to Surviving Humanity. And at that point, there was the big shakeup in the industry and Daw pretty much cut their anthology line from like 6 to 8 a year down to like 2 a year, if that. But like I said in the intro, the editing bug had kind of bitten hard at that point. Like Sam said, I really enjoyed it. It's a lot of fun putting the anthologies together and reading the stories and et cetera, et cetera. So I decided, because I was bored one summer, that I would start up a small press. And I wanted a name for the small press that screamed science fiction fantasy, but at the same time was fun. I wanted, because I'm doing this for fun. So I wanted it to have that flavor. And so I decided to go with Zombies Need Brains, because some people that were in that original group had thrown a party at the Saratoga Springs convention. I think that was also World Fantasy. Sam was one of the ones that was included in that party. There were 6 of us, I think, for that.
George Martin had a great time.
And George Martin was there and basically sat down in the middle of the party at the beginning, and he stayed all night and just sat and held the court in the middle of the party. So it was a spectacular party. But we called the party Zombies Need Brains. And so it's kind of like our core group, because a lot of the people in that, or that held that party, were the core authors in the first couple anthologies for Daw and whatnot. So it was all tied together from that. And so, and I just like the name Zombies Need Brains. It had all the flavor that I wanted. So that's where the name came from. And I threw that first Kickstarter in 2013, I think. And the book came out in 2014. The first anthology was called The Clockwork Universe, Steampunk versus Aliens. Unfortunately, it's out of print at this point. But we got that first Kickstarter to work and got it funded, and that money also helped set up the small press. And I was doing one anthology at the start. Oh, he's got the Sam's got the cover. One anthology from the start, and then 1 year I did 2, and I only did that for 1 year, and now I've been doing 3 per year since then. So, and that hopefully, who knows what's going to happen with the coronavirus stuff going on, but hopefully we can pull together 3 and get it funded this year as well. So that's a little iffier this year just because of where the whole world is. But yeah, that's Zombies Need Brains in a nutshell.
Oh, thank you. Now, let's each talk about the one you worked on editing-wise. I know Joshua did all of them, but let me go ahead and start with Sam. Tell us about the anthology that you worked on this year.
Well, I don't know whether it's lucky or unlucky, but we certainly got a timely anthology this year with Apocalyptic. Although I have to say, I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, Josh, but we don't have a pandemic in there, do we? I mean, we refer to there are some pandemics in the past tense, but nothing like an actual in-the-moment pandemic. There are pandemics that have happened, but the story takes place after the pandemic. We don't have any actual. We're not living through it in the book. So hopefully that'll be a reason to buy it. Because you're not gonna have to live through it again.
The closest one I can think of is the Tale of Two Apocalypses.
Yeah, but that's really a zombie story. That's really a zombie story. It's not a flu bug. So.
Yeah, it's not a flu. It's certainly not.
It's not a flu. But it was really a very interesting one to do, because with a lot of these anthologies that we do, you can get limited topics or big topics. And since part of what Zombies Needs Brains always likes to do is to get a mix of stories, some science fiction, some humor, some fantasy, some horror. I mean, I've even said, if send us a good romance story that fits, and we'll put that in the book too. It's there's really no limitation. And something like Apocalyptic lends itself to everything. Maybe not so many science fiction ideas, but we got a good break. lots of different kinds of stories. We also had, the downside would be, we set a huge new record for the number of submissions. As Josh says, we had, we usually have, there are usually about 6, 7, 8 anchor authors in an anthology. And Zombies Needs Brains, we had the 6, 7, 8 anchor authors, and we needed 7 more stories. And I think we got 790 submissions in 3 months for those other 7 stories, which was what, Josh, was that 250 more than we ever got before for anything?
Yeah, I think so. I think you're underballing it too. I thought we had like closer to 850 stories.
Maybe. Well, I just checked the number, and I may not have gotten the right spreadsheet, but it was a lot of stories.
A lot.
It was a lot of stories. I don't know how Josh read all those stories. Plus, well, actually, we had more stories than the other two anthos combined, right? More subs.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's the good and the bad. The good of that is we had a lot of good stories, and we really had to cut. There were some stories that would probably have made the final cut in something that had fewer submissions, and we got a really good range. We've got some really oddball stories. We've got some straight ahead stories. We got some funny stories. We've got some scary stories. We've got some sad stories. And one of my favorite for apocalyptic stories is we've got a lot of stories that are very bittersweet, on the beach kind of stories. And it was a great chance. I've now, I think this is my 4th anthology I've done with Josh. And this is a great chance to see lots of different styles of writing and different ideas. And it was wonderful that way.
Okay, great. And Joshua, could you talk about Galactic Stew?
Yeah. The basic premise of Galactic Stew is the simplest premise, I think. I think it was even simpler than Apocalyptic, was food. The whole point of the anthology was science fiction and fantasy stories that were centered around food. And I think the biggest challenge for writers with this particular anthology was, it's easy to summarize food. The challenge was the food had to be integral to the story. So if you took the food out, the story had to fall apart. And I would say that was the biggest issue that we kept running into with the submissions that we got for it, the open call, was that, there was food there, but the food didn't really matter. So the key to getting into this anthology was making sure that the food was integral to the story itself. And then, of course, the other usual problems with stories is that, it has to have a character arc. It has to have, some depth. It can't just be an idea. Okay, it's got to be a full-fledged story. But the key for this one was most definitely the food. And one of the things I liked about this anthology theme, as opposed to like the Apocalyptic, you're going to get more sort of contemporary world, right? But with some science fiction element that's gone wrong with the world. This one I like the theme because it could be fantasy and science fiction, right? You could have a fantasy world with a story centered around food there, or you could have a heavy duty science fiction story, or you can have more of a horror modern day world story as well. And we got a full range. In fact, usually with these types of anthology themes where it can be fantasy or science fiction, I try to even it out a little bit. So it's about half fantasy and half science fiction. Doesn't always work because it depends on what we get into submissions. Okay? But just like Sam said with the Apocalyptic, we got a ton of submissions. I think we were 450, 500 submissions for this one. And of course, we're looking at like 7 slots so to fill. So the competition on this one was really, really heavy. David Coe is the co-editor on this one, and we had a hard time picking out the ones that we wanted to take in the end, because like Sam said, we usually get a good grouping of solid stories. So after you narrow it down to those solid stories, it's always a matter of you're trying to balance the humor with the darkness, and you know, you're trying to get an overall feeling for the anthology, sort of like an atmosphere for the anthology. So you end up killing some stories off the list just because it's going to stick out like a sore thumb when you hold it up to all of the other stories. And so I think it's a very well-rounded anthology in terms of the stories. Like a wide variety. We've got the humor all the way up to you know, the heavy-duty literary kind of story. The full spectrum, you know, light to dark. Although I will say this one does kind of have a slight tendency a little more toward the darker side, which is surprising since it's supposed to be about food. But
Yeah, you expect that with Apocalypse. You don't expect that with food.
yeah, the food, I was surprised how many of the stories and tended toward the darker side. But some really, really good, strong stories in this one, I think. And there are some lighter elements in there as well. It's not all dark, obviously. But I think David and I are extremely happy with the outcome for this anthology.
Okay. And Crystal, how about yours?
Well, with Battery, it you know, if anybody was paying attention, I guess a little over a year ago now, when Opportunity kind of sent its last message from Mars, one of the mission specialists had his own interpretation. You know, instead of the, you know, hardcore data message, he kind of translated it as "my battery is low and it is getting dark." And I know that a lot of us just, you know, fell in love with that. There was such a romantic idea of this little rover who had already exceeded all expectations for technology on this planet, just there by itself, kind of dwindling away. And then, you know, Joshua said, "But what happens now?" You know, and that kind of sprang forth the idea for this anthology of, you know, what happens when technology has a second life, whether it's discovered by somebody or kind of does its own thing, you know, Wall-E-esque kind of evolution. So that was the theme. I think it was a hard theme. We had a lot of submissions that were near misses, I think, and you know, maybe our two authors can also talk about what, you know, what it was for them writing. I think it was a little bit hard to kind of nail down. We were looking for stories that weren't just dark and apocalyptic. We had a lot of those come in anyway, but we wanted those stories too that had a little bit of hopefulness, a little bit of that bittersweet element to it. There were a lot of interesting things that came in, but it was a really enjoyable experience to see the very different takes that people had on this idea.
Okay, great. And that actually leads into my next question for both John and Alex. I'll start with you, John. You kind of touched on it, on how working on an anthology is different than the books, but taking off of Crystal's, you now have to write to a prompt. What does that do to your writing?
So when I first sat down to write the story, I knew the story I wanted to write for this anthology from the second I got Joshua's email. It bears zero resemblance to the story I wrote for this anthology.
Of course.
I wanted to write an epistolary sci-fi horror story, and I was jazzed about writing it, and I wrote the first 3,000 words of an epistolary sci-fi horror story 3 times. And all 9,000 words of it were straight garbage. I either hated the plot or I hated the character. And finally, I was just like, okay, I am not writing an epistolary science fiction horror story. And then I was like, okay, I've thought for 6 months that I was writing one story. And I obviously can't write that story right now because these efforts at it are dumpster fires. So I started fresh, and I thought back to the core and the spark that sparked the anthology was a signal. It was a last signal. I was like, okay, I can go with that. So then I thought, okay, if the core of it is a signal, what's it a signal for? Who's it coming from? Who's it going to? Then I had to start with all of the what if questions and the questions that build the story. And then I had to try and get it down to 7,500 words, at which I failed miserably.
Yes, yes, you did.
Yes, yes, I did. Not for the first time in this spate of anthologies. I sent in a story and said, I'm sorry, I don't know what else to cut, just tell me. And Joshua and Crystal were great, as was Emily Leverett, who edited me in Predators and Petticoats, because I did the same thing to her. I said, I'm 1,000 words over your word limit. I know there's stuff to cut, but I can't see it. So.
And the issue was what you said earlier, is you were writing a novel.
Yeah.
Yeah, you were trying to write a novel. And so our critique wasn't, we told you what to cut, but we told you why to cut it. We were like, hey, this would work perfectly fine in a novel, but that's not what we're doing here.
Right. And this was a set of muscles, writing muscles, that had atrophied for me. I had not written anything shorter than 30,000 words for 4 or 5 years until last year. And even when the stuff I wrote for Chris Kennedy's Salvage Universe anthology, I gave Chris 10,000 words. I said, hey, Chris, here's 10,000 words. He's like, okay, great. I'll take 10,000 words. It's like, all right. I did one for Laurel K. Hamilton that was 9,500 words. I'm like, hey, here's 9,495 words. And they sent it back. And they said, great. 7,500 words is tight. What I ended up creating was actually an homage to one of my favorite series. This story is an homage to a Jonathan Mayberry series. This is an homage to his Rotten Ruin series, which is my favorite zombie apocalypse series. And I messaged Jonathan and told him, I said, hey, so I just kind of wrote an homage to your story. He said, okay, thanks.
I mean, I think you sent us almost 11,000, so I was very impressed that you got it down as much as you did.
It's not uncommon to have an anchor author send in what is a novel that you have to then cut, or what is on its way to a novel. And it's sort of the opposite thing we get from a lot of the straight subbers, who it's obviously part of a novel, but they don't send the 30,000 word novel. They send the first chapter, and you come to the end and you go, okay, where's the story?
Yeah.
So it's like two different sides of the same coin.
And I can see where it would be a more common problem with your anchor authors, because most of us are anchor authors because we have somewhat of a following, and we get that following by selling books. There aren't very many people today who get by selling short fiction. So we make our bread and butter selling novels.
And we've discussed it a little bit, anchor author and then open call. Could someone define what an anchor author is for someone that doesn't know?
Oh, it's basically it's a term I coined. I don't know if anybody else uses it. Okay, I wasn't sure.
It's because they're dead weights.
Really heavy. I dragged the whole ship down, baby.
Now, the anchor authors are the authors that we send an invitation to ahead of time and say, we want to create this anthology with this theme, and we would like you to have a story in it, and here's our rate and time schedule and whatnot. And part of our agreement, I don't know if this is true with everybody, but part of the Zombies agreement is the anchor author is supposed to help us get the funding for the Kickstarter. So they have to be willing to help us promote the Kickstarter, put their name on the Kickstarter, et cetera, and essentially we're using the fan bases of the anchor authors to pull in enough people into the Kickstarter to get the funding for the anthology. And I at the time that I created Zombies Need Brains, that was the only way I could think of to find the audience, a large enough audience to fund a Kickstarter for an anthology where I wanted to pay artists pro rates, I wanted to pay the authors pro rates. I didn't want to start off paying people like 1 cent a word or anything like that. I wanted to start off at the pro level. And so it was the only way I could think of to get enough of an audience to fund the Kickstarter. But at the same time, I didn't want to do the entire anthology with anchor authors. I wanted there to be room for people to send in whatever they had that fit the theme and pick the best stories from the slush pile for that. So I wanted to do an open call as well. So I just split it 50-50. I said, half of the anthology will be anchors, and that should be enough to pull in the money that we need. And then the other half will be open call. Anybody could submit, including, big name people if they wanted to submit. And that's actually happened in some of our anthologies where we had somebody that is a name in the business already that just sent in something at random to the open call in hopes that it would catch our attention and be good enough to be included. So yeah, that's the difference. Anchor author, they were invited, they were guaranteed a slot in the anthology as long as they helped us with the Kickstarter. Open call, just anybody can submit as long as it's related to the theme, of course, and then we read all of those stories and pull out whatever we think is good enough from what we call the slush. That's where Alex came in.
I will say that this has been something I've always admired about Zombies, is the dedication to an open call, because more and more anthologies these days are invitation only. And as we've lost more and more magazines, it makes it harder for authors who want to do short stories to find a home for those. And I do wish that more anthology editors would kind of pay attention to that and realize that there's a lot of fresh talent out there to find if you just give people the chance, even if you have to read 1,500 stories. Joshua.
Yeah.
All right.
I have to say that I am surprised that I managed to get all of the stories read for all 3 anthologies in a timely manner. This past year, I pulled it off.
You made the deadline.
When I've co-edited anthologies, I always made sure that I had a very dedicated co-editor. So I just stopped when the story sucked, and they had to read the whole thing. So there are some that I'm like, that my co-editor has said, so this one, the first 1,000 words are not great, but it gets pretty good. I was like, yeah, I stopped reading a paragraph too.
Yeah, that's one thing I find really, really hard to do is I pretty much end up reading all of the stories all the way through. I mean, there's a certain point where I'll say, okay, like writing is not good enough here, in which case I might start skimming, but I'm still looking for that point where maybe it switches from being, bad to, oh wait, there is a cool idea here, and oh, look, the story really does start on page 5. You know, if you cut 4 pages, then you've got a good story there. I don't want to, my fear is if I stop reading after a couple paragraphs or a page or two or something, then I'm going to miss that good story. So it's really hard for me to stop early. Of course, if we start getting, 3,000 submissions for each anthology, then I'm not going to be able to do that.
All bets are off then, maybe.
Yeah. We might have to have slush readers or something like that if we get up that high. But so far, I'm able to handle everything. So.
All right, Alex, how about with you?
So this is the 3rd year that I've been in a Zombies Need Brains anthology, and the 5th year that I have submitted. No, sorry, 6th year I have submitted. So it took me about the first 3 years, and in fact, one of the stories that I submitted to Where was ended up being published in The Razor's Edge because I fixed the story, and the thing that needed to be fixed in that story just made it perfect for that anthology. But for this one was an interesting one just because of the time in my life that had the events that had just happened. Last year in June, I lost my father, and I know, John, you can sympathize. And I had taken care of my father for a long. What was that?
There were 2 weeks between Alex and I going through the same thing.
Yeah, it was a rough month. But I had taken care of my father. I've been the sole caretaker for my father for probably eight years. And I have been doing that since I was 19, which is a hell of a time to have to step up and do that. So it was a big life adjustment for me, but the anthologies came out and I already loved My Battery is Low and It's Getting Dark, that like a lot of people, that really hit me when I saw that come out. And so I was sitting thinking about this anthology. I'm like, what am I going to write for this one? And I realized that I wanted to write something with a character that I'd written before. And there was a story that I submitted to another Zombies Need Brains anthology, The Death of All Things, called What Lies Beyond. And there was a personification of death that I used in that one that I really liked and already had an idea of, I want to write more stories with this version of death. And so I came into this one going, okay, that's what I want to do. How do I make that work? And then that's where the thought of, what if the first android to ever have a soul, to become sentient and have a soul, has a conversation with death? What does that look like? And that's where the whole story came from. So this story is really personal to me, just because it was kind of a healing thing, because this character got to, die. I mean, the story starts with the death, and have this conversation of death with death, and have it be completely different than what you would expect it to be. And that's kind of what I loved about this personification, and what I want to do with any story I write with it is just, it's all conversations with death that completely do not go the way you would expect it to.
I mean, that for me, when I read that, Alex, because I'm a sucker for death stories, that's my jam. And it was that pairing of, oh, this is a story about death, but oh no, these are what, androids, but they're talking, and I'm like, ooh, it was a good mix.
Thank you.
So
Sounds great.
one question that I want to throw out again to John and Alex at this point, and anyone else that's submitted stories to anthologies, any anthologies, is what does it benefit you as a writer, especially John as an established writer, to continue throwing out short stories? You said one thing is to work those muscles, but what else does it do for you?
Well, one, we get paid.
Yeah.
Ka-ching.
Last
Number
year,
one.
like Joshua said, Zombies Need Brains pays pro rates. I've been publishing fiction since 2009, And my first 2 SIFWA qualifying short fiction sales were in 2019. And one of them was this story. Now, I've been a SIFWA member through my novel sales for a while, but my first pro-rate sales were last year after 10 years in the business. So that ain't nothing. As writers, you'll hear people talk about the different pots of money. Anything that pays the power bill, that's a good check. So for me, I typically take on projects for one of 3 reasons. Either the money is stupid. This money was good. This money was not stupid money. There are people that I want to work with because I respect them and I feel like it would do my career good and I could learn from them. That's what drew me to this project, because Joshua and his company are very well regarded by people I respect. And as a writer, an editor, and a publisher, I figure there are things I can learn from working with Joshua and whoever he had co-editing. I didn't know Crystal prior to this project. So with this project in particular, there were people I wanted to work with. Then the other one is it gets my work in front of new audiences. There are people who buy every Zombies Need Brains anthology that have never bought a John Hartness book. Those people will hopefully really enjoy this story, will realize from the very ending of the story that this ties into universes I publish books in, and then will come pay me. And with the other anchor authors, I can leech fans off other writers. So with the anthology I was in that came out earlier this year, Fantastic Hope, it was edited by Laurel K. Hamilton. Jonathan Mayberry was in it, Kevin J. Anderson, and Patty Briggs. If you're an urban fantasy writer and you get to be on Team and More when those are the names on the cover, you're the winner. And with this, there are people involved in this anthology. They may not have Jonathan Mayberry or Patricia Briggs level fan bases, but they're people who have never bought my books, and hopefully now they will. So it's very calculated when I'm choosing the projects that I take on. It's got to serve one of those things for me, because this isn't for funsies. This is how I feed my family. So I'm always thinking about, if I'm going to spend 2 weeks, 3 weeks working on a story and social media time helping to promote the Kickstarter and time helping to promote the release, how's it going to work out for me professionally? And so far it's worked out very well, because I've had a really good time working with these folks editorially. And when you own the press that publishes most of your stuff, there's a different editorial relationship than when you are not paying the person who's giving you your notes.
All right. Anyone have anything else to add?
So for me, I'm on that other side of the spectrum where I'm not being invited in. I have to, jump in there and punch everybody in the face to get out of my way so that I actually have my slot. And honestly, hopefully, it's the same as that now, especially since I've got A Web of Crimson out and second book's coming at the end of this year. Hopefully, people will look at go back and start seeing the books that I have coming out, and we'll go for that. But at the same time, I'm like, this is science fiction with a dash of fantasy in it, and they're going to be like, all right, what else do they write? Historical urban fantasy. So I don't know if they're going to quite make that jump, but hopefully they will. But I think, writing short stories for anthologies like this, like the thing that I just realized is that with this sale, I am SIFWA eligible. So this was my SIFWA eligible sale. So that's something I get to do now, and makes me feel like I'm part of the club. And
Literally.
Yeah, literally. Gotta pay your dues.
Yeah,
I got to do that.
which I totally would if there wasn't a global pandemic right now. But that's one of the things about anthologies and working with Zombies Need Brains that I've always liked, is that there are other anthologies that you can go for and other people that you can work with, but Zombies Need Brains is right there on the SIFWA website. It's one of the qualifying markets, and that's a big thing for someone who's not an anchor author and is really just now starting to publish stuff, that it's a way to get in and get those resources that I may not get. I could write 12 of these novellas and I may not be qualified with the market, whereas I can with Zombies Need Brains. And on top of that, when I started writing, I never would have thought that I would write science fiction. Now with Zombies Need Brains, I've published 2 science fiction stories. And so you get into things that you don't expect, and it makes you think in a way, especially having the themed anthologies, because I block out time at the end of the year to write for Zombies Need Brains. That's just part of my yearly routine. And I know I'm going to at least try to write for one. One year I got to submit to 2. But I know that I'm going to do that. It's just something that I'm, always going to do. And each year I have no idea what I'm going to write for a story when I go in. And as soon as that anthology drops, I get to thinking, and these stories would never have happened without these anthologies. And so that's another great thing. It really makes you better as a writer.
One of the things that I love about writing short fiction, and this is something I tell when I meet with young writers, I think that there's an advantage to writing short fiction as you're kind of figuring out who you are as a writer, because you get to write something that you finish, that you don't necessarily have to spend 80 or 90 or 100,000 words on. Especially when you're starting out, it's too easy to get caught up in novel length, and you don't really learn. But with short fiction, you got to write a beginning, a middle, and an end, and you got to get it out there, and then you move on to the next thing. And I think people underestimate how critical and helpful that can be just in developing your writing skills.
It also teaches you a lot about the submission process, the editorial process, how things get done outside of the writing part of it. That when I wrote my first novel, I put it in a drawer for a year and submitted poetry and short fiction to literary magazines for a year to learn how books get sold and how stories get sold to publishers. That is not a good route to making a living. Submitting poetry to online literary magazines will not make your house payment.
That'll get you a cup of coffee if you're lucky.
If you're lucky.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Alexander.
I was going to say, and talking about that pay, I'll say that 2 years in a row, getting the paycheck from Zombies Need Brains saved my ass. 2 years in a row, I ended up losing an entire paycheck and being okay, because it was the exact time that I was getting my check from Zombies Need Brains. And so, yeah, getting paid is nice.
Zombies Needs Brains remains the only place I've ever gotten a royalty payment from. One other thing about the process of writing stories for specific anthologies like that, which I think John touched on, which I think is very important, at least from my perspective as a writer, is it's a challenge. I wrote a story for the very first anthology for the Urbar. I wasn't an anchor author, but I would have to say I probably wasn't quite slush either, because I went in and discussed what I was going to write with Josh and Patricia before I wrote it. And I came in with an idea of what I was going to write, and they said, no. We have too many people writing stories after the 18th century. We need something much earlier than that. Let's see. And then, I don't know, was it Patricia said, why don't you write a story about Vikings, Sam? Because I had a prominent talking, shape-changing bear in my novels, and Patricia thought, you could do berserkers. Okay, all right. So I've been told what I'm supposed to write. And so I've got to write a story about bars set in the Viking era, it's set in Scandinavia, 900 AD. So I start doing my research, and I finally start to put something together that I can do when I come to the part which really floors me. And one of the books I'm doing research in says the Vikings had no bars. So, okay, now what do I do? Well, I write a story called Why the Vikings Had No Bars. And it's great because, you have something you have to do. You have to figure out something that will fit what you have to do. And I think these themed anthologies are a wonderful way to do that. Makes your brain work.
And the research that you can end up doing, like there's within Terra 356, I probably spent 4 days researching black holes to figure out how, because I wanted a theory of how this ship is going to travel black holes that was viable. Now, is it something that we're going to ever be able to do? Possibly not. You can't really, we don't even completely know that exotic matter or dark matter exists, but it was just like learning about how black holes exist, that there are two kinds of black holes. Didn't even realize that. Yeah, did not know. There's the Kerr black holes and the Schwartz, not the Schwartz. I can't remember the other one, but it's like one of them has a circular singularity, and the other one is round. It's like this. The singularity goes around like in a halo, and I was just like, okay. And so I spent 4 days researching black holes to get this working thing and to figure out how this goes. And I think that really added to the story is that when you read that, I really hope that at least all of that research comes across and that it's all actual scientific theory and not just complete crap I made up.
Sometime ask when there's more time left, ask Josh about Sumerian straws sometime.
All right.
Yeah, I'm not a heavy duty researcher, but Patricia insisted.
Once you found it, it had to be the story.
Oh yeah. Once I read that, I was like, oh yeah, that's a cool idea. And I don't think many people realized they had straws back then and whatnot. So, and they have straws. The whole point of the straw was because their beer back then had all like husks and all this kind of stuff on top, and they didn't want to be drinking the husks. So they put straw in to get below the husk.
That's fair.
Totally made sense.
I'm with it.
So, Sam, let's start with you. What surprised you the most with the anthology you've just worked on?
I think I already touched on a little bit the fact that we really didn't have a scary flu pandemic story. We'd actually had one in the last one of the last, I think it was the last antho I worked on, Portals. But we didn't actually have one this time. We had zombies. We had the after effects of pandemics, stories that took place afterwards. And Josh and I had been scared to death that we were going to get, 1,000, superbug stories. And this has happened before. I think, what was it? I think it was Submerged we worked on, and we were convinced we were going to get 100 mermaid stories. But we didn't get 100 mermaids. I think we got 2. And so it's often interesting. I think a lot of the writers, they say, oh, well, this is the obvious story. I can't write it. It's the obvious story. And so they then turn the other way and try to figure out because you don't want to be the guy who writes one of 50 mermaid stories or one of 50 superbug stories. You want to be the guy who writes the story that nobody else thought of. And so it's always pleasantly surprising, I think, when what we expect does not happen. And surprisingly, it usually doesn't happen, but we still suspect it's going to happen anyway.
All right, Crystal.
It's pretty much the same thing. I was very surprised and a little disappointed we didn't have a Rover story submitted for this one. And while I get that you want to be the unique person, you want to have the unique voice, I hope that people don't self-reject just because they think it's really obvious. If you've got a good story, write it and send it, because everybody else probably self-rejected too, and you might get through this way. So who the hell knows, right?
Nothing ventured, nothing gained.
And Joshua, did you have anything with the Galactic Stew that surprised you?
I was surprised at just the nice variety of stories that we got. But it's kind of along the same lines as what everybody else was saying. Like for Galactic Stew, of course, we were expecting poison stories. Right? Poison. Hundreds of poison stories. And we didn't really get a lot of poison stories. And problems with the ones that we did get, the main problem was that, the poison was like 2 paragraphs on 1 page and didn't really have any big influence on the rest of the plot. And so we're not going to take that if we want food to be the main point. So looking through the table of contents, I don't think we have a poison story in the end at all. But I do want to emphasize what Crystal said. There is an obvious story, like a poison story for Galactic Stew, or a pandemic flu for Apocalyptic, or something like that. It's not that we don't want those stories. What we're trying to say to people is we're trying to say, we're not going to do an anthology with all pandemic flu stories. It's if we get 100 pandemic flu stories, we're going to pick the best one and put that one in there. So if you're doing the obvious story, just be aware that you're probably going to have more competition trying to get into that one slot. And so in the end, we were kind of looking for Galactic Stew. We were kind of looking for a poison story, but we're not gonna put it in unless we can get a good poison story. So if, like Crystal said, if you have a really good idea that fits that theme, even if it's kind of an obvious idea, send it in, because we are expecting and are probably looking for that quote unquote obvious idea. We just want it to be done really, really well. And you're going to have a lot of competition for that plot. So,
or maybe you won't.
And maybe you won't. I mean, like Crystal said, maybe if authors are sort of self-selecting themselves out of that because they say, oh, wait, that's too obvious. We got to do something else. Do the obvious story and then do a second story. One of the things with zombies is you can send in more than one story for this. I will warn against sending in 25 stories to the same because after we read the first 3 or 4, kind of formed an opinion on you, and when we hit that next one, it's going to be harder to convince us otherwise. But, that doesn't mean if you have 2 good ideas for one anthology, send both of them in. You don't have to pick one. If you have time to write both, write both.
We had quite a few multiple submissions for Apocalyptic.
Yeah.
I would say we had 5 or 6 people submit more than one story, and a couple submitted more than 2 or 3 stories.
Wow.
And
we had more than 10.
And we had one story that was submitted for Battery that we both loved, but just didn't quite fit the theme that Joshua ended up grabbing for Apocalyptic, right?
Yep, I moved that one over. When I read it I was just like, this is not a bad story. This is an apocalyptic story.
Yeah.
Was this the one we added to Apocalyptic?
Yeah, that's the one we added at the end. Apocalyptic.
That's happened before. I think, wasn't it a Ware story that ended up in Submerged? And that was a year apart, I think.
Yeah, we had a Ware submission that ended up in the Razor's Edge. That was Alex's. And then we had a Ware submission that made it into Submerged.
Right. And one of my favorite ideas Josh has had, which he still hasn't done yet, is to do an anthology with all the great stories that didn't quite fit what they were submitted to for one reason or another, but were still really good stories. The only trouble is there's no way to kickstart that because we already have the stories.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't figured out how to make something like that work.
I bet if you went to your 7 favorite writers and said, give me your favorite story that you couldn't sell.
That's a good idea. Stories that couldn't sell.
Kickstart that.
The Untouchables.
The Untouchables.
Get in touch.
All right. So when are these anthologies coming out?
If you back the Kickstarter, then you will be getting the anthology, assuming shipping and stuff isn't blocked by the coronavirus stuff. The expectation is that everybody should be getting their Kickstarter version in June. The general public versions are going to go on sale on July 1st. So you can pre-order the ebooks and the paperbacks at the Zombies Need Brains website, which is just zombiesneedbrains.com. And just go to the store there and you can pre-order any of them. You can also pre-order the Kindle right now at Amazon. So the Kindle, and you should be able to, within the next couple of days, be able to pre-order on Nook and Kobo as well. So the EPUB and whatnot from Nook and Kobo. And then it's will be available at other platforms on July 1st. I don't know if they have the pre-orders set up for those. And then at this point, the only place you can pre-order the paperback copies, you can get the Kickstarter version if you want, or the trade paperback version. The only place you can pre-order those on the Zombies online store. But they will be available at other outlets like Amazon and whatnot on July 1st. They just, for some reason, don't let you set up a pre-order. But yeah, everything will be available to everybody on July 1st, pretty much everywhere.
Josh, have you anticipated any printing problems at all? Because I've read in a couple spots that a couple of the big printers in the U.S. are going bankrupt. They may only be for the mainstream publishers. I don't know, but have you seen any of that information?
No, I did have to change printers this year, but that's because the printer I was using in previous years got bought out and basically gutted once they were bought out. So I did have to find a new printer, but the new printer, I mean, the anthologies are in, and they told me that I should have they should be shipped by the 22nd of this month. So I should definitely have them in June, and I will be shipping out the Kickstarter stuff in June. I mean, I talked to them today, actually, this morning, and they said everything's on track, and so as far as I know, will be good to go.
Cool.
All right. So you've already mentioned the Zombies Need Brains website. Where else can people find you?
Sam was going to say something.
No, I wouldn't say. I don't know why I didn't say anything at all.
Well, your screen lit up. So, I mean, you can find the product itself at Amazon, Barnes & Noble. Pretty much all of the ebook platforms have it, like Scribed, and all of the different ebook platforms will have it as well. So I think that's about it.
And you can follow Zombies on Twitter. You can also find Zombies on Facebook, especially if you want to stay up to date on the next Kickstarter. Can you tell marketing's my thing?
Hey, I was thinking in terms of product. I wasn't thinking in terms of present.
And there's a Patreon page too, in there.
There is a Patreon page. Yep. You can get a little bit of a head start if you're a patron at our Patreon page. Just look for Zombies and Brains on Patreon. But yeah, like Crystal said, we have a Facebook page. Just look for Zombies Need Brains there. And our Twitter handle is ZNBLLC. ZNBLLC. So follow us on Twitter. Earliest place you can catch info, though, is on Patreon. I give them a little bit of a head start. And we usually announce our new themes in July, and then, like I said, the new Kickstarter usually goes live sometime in August. That's typical. Can't 100% guarantee it this year because everything's up. But at the moment, it's the schedule.
All right, thank you. And Crystal, where can they find you if they want to look for you?
Sure, crystalsarakas.com. I'm on Twitter at @csarakas. Nobody's ever going to be able to spell this. You can also find me on Facebook. Crystal Sarakas is there as well.
Okay, Sam?
Right now I am only on Facebook as SC Butler. I'm in the process of trying to set something. It's been a couple of years since I've had a web page. I'm in the process of probably selling books myself that I've been unable to sell over the last couple of years, and so I'm in the process of putting the web page together and starting to assemble book product there for that as well. So right now the only place though is SC Butler at Facebook.
All right, John?
You can find me at johnhartness.com. You can follow me at John Hartness on Twitter. I have a Facebook group, John G. Hartness Books. I also have a Facebook page, which is the Facebook group is the best for real interaction. So just we approve all members that aren't obvious bot accounts. So as long as you don't look like you want to sell me designer sunglasses for $29.99, I'll probably approve your membership to the John G. Hartness Books Facebook group. And of course, you can find me at falstaffbooks.com.
Finally, Alex.
You can find me at alexandergideon.net because two doctors own .com and will not sell it to me. You can also read my blog at readasthouwill.com. It's questionably helpful, so mileage may vary. You can find me on Twitter at Alexander Gideon and on Facebook as Alexander G.R. Gideon.
All right. I want to thank everyone for coming in and thank everyone for watching. This has been Hot Off the Press.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye.